Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 211 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Stephen Baxter. He's the author of over 40 books, including the Zeely series, the Manifold series, and the Time Ships, the only authorized sequel to H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. He's also collaborated with Terry Pratchett on the Long Cosmos series, and with Arthur C. Clarke on books such as Time's Eye and The Light of Other Days. Baxter's latest book, which he wrote with Alastair Reynolds, is called the Medusa Chronicles. And now, here's our interview with Stephen Baxter. All right, so we're here with Stephen Baxter. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Okay, so your new book, which you wrote with Alastair Reynolds, is called The Medusa Chronicles, and it's a sequel to Arthur C. Clarke's story, A Meeting with Medusa. So first of all, just tell us about the original Arthur C. Clarke story. What's that about?
Well, it's from 1971, and I think it's generally seen as his last really significant piece of short fiction. Won a couple of awards, and it's about Jupiter. The Medusa of the title is a life form that lives in the clouds of Jupiter. And all this comes from Carl Sagan, actually, the great astronomer, who hypothesized that somewhere in Jupiter's deep cloud layers, it's very hot at the center, cold at the top, so somewhere in the middle will be Earth-like. And you could have a kind of great ocean, a gaseous ocean where gigantic creatures could live. And the Medusas are kind of whale-like creatures, really. So the story is about an astronaut, Howard Falcon, who goes on a kind of balloon dive into Jupiter and encounters these Medusas, as the title suggests. Has various perils along the way, escapes just about with his life. But there's a twist at the end when you find out that actually Falcon is a cyborg, a kind of experimental cyborg. He'd been through an accident earlier in his career, which had left him crippled, and he's now half man, half machine. Which is how he was able to withstand Jupiter's high gravity and so on. And that was what inspired Al in particular about doing a sequel. There's a great line at the end where he says he was neither man nor machine, but both sides of that divide would have need of him in the troubled centuries to come. And so the young Al, that really inspired him to wonder what would have happened next, what would happen in these troubled centuries as a conflict on an interplanetary scale, developed between man and machine. And that was where we started from.
Right. I want to say a little bit more about Arthur C. Clarke, because obviously he's just one of the all-time greats when it comes to science fiction. Could you just say a little bit about what makes him such an important writer?
Well, he was certainly important to me because of his very cool and kind of lofty intellect, and his great prose as well. He's in the tradition of H.G. Wells and Olaf Stapledon, who did, Wells, the great pioneer of British science fiction, or the founder of British science fiction. Olaf Stapledon in the 30s, who wrote on vast scales of space and time, but with a kind of authoritative science background to it all. The future of mankind in a billion years and so forth. And that was what inspired the young Clarke, who was a farmer's boy from Somerset, which is rural England. And he aspired to the same kind of sensibility, but he told really compelling human stories as well. For instance, Childhood's End, one of his more famous novels, is about the aliens come to the Earth. But why? Because humanity is about to evolve into a higher form, which is a common thing through the universe, and the aliens are here as kind of midwives to this process. So this is a very lofty theme, you see, a very high concept. But the story Clarke actually tells is of a mother who's going to lose her child. He's a boy, he grows up to the age of 10 or so. Then he starts developing strange powers. The aliens recognize what's going on, and he gets taken away in the end. So on the one hand, you've got this magnificent, high concept story of human evolution going on, but it's told through the tale of a mother and a son, with all sorts of resonances, for how you lose your kids when they grow up anyway. So this great artistry combined with the great themes that he was dealing with, that's what makes him really great, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he's also well known for coming up with the concepts for the space elevator and the communication satellites.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's the other side of him. His background was engineering. He worked on radar, um, experimental radar techniques during the Second World War for the RAF, and he came out of that with an understanding of telecommunications and satellites. As you say, he came up with the notion of 24-hour orbit satellites beaming signals across the whole hemisphere of the Earth. And the space elevator, he wasn't original with that, I don't think, but he kind of dug it up from the writings of Tsiolkovsky, who was an old Russian from 50 years earlier, I think, popularized it and really launched it into the modern frame of thinking. In his novel, he proposed how it might be built, and then the engineers get hold of that and say, well, this wouldn't work, but you could do it that way. So he was a genuine visionary in terms of his non-fiction output as well, and definitely inspired the NASA guys who later went to the moon. As I recall, one of the Apollo craft was called Odyssey after 2001: The Space Odyssey, and one of the Apollo orbital missions, I think it was Apollo 10, they were planning to play a prank. Having gone around the back of the moon, they were going to say there's a huge monolith standing there. If only they had, but they didn't. They backed out. They chickened out in the end. But that shows the influence, that you're going around the moon and you're thinking of Clarke's movie.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you actually knew Clarke pretty well, right?
Yeah. Well, I worked with him. We wrote 4 novels together. In the end, he, my own first novel was published 25 years ago and sent to Clarke for a blurb, and he gave it a nice blurb, a promising writer. But then a few years later, the way these tangled things work, I did a sequel to H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, and that was sent to Clarke, and he really liked it. He didn't actually produce a blurb that you could use on the cover of the book, but we kind of got in contact after that. He sent me he had a souvenir postcard of H.G. Wells, would you believe, which he sent me, for instance, and then we started corresponding, and I interviewed him a couple of times for the magazines. So then a few years after that, this is late 90s, he came up with an idea for a book. By that time, he was fairly, his health wasn't great in his old age, and he looked for collaborators. So I was in the frame as a collaborator for this next novel series that he wanted to work on. I only actually met him once. He came to Britain. When was this? Early 90s, for one of the Arthur C. Clarke Award events. That's for the best SF novel published in Britain each year. And I was nominated, although I didn't win. And in his hometown, so he came there, and my wife and I met him with his brother, who was also a successful writer in plumbing, would you believe? He wrote a plumbing textbook that became the standard for students in Britain. He claimed he made more money from writing that textbook than Arthur did from his science fiction.
Oh, jeez.
Could well be true. So, face-to-face, Clarke he's quite a shy man. He wasn't a great socialite. Found it difficult to make small talk, but he was friendly. I think he found it easier to communicate through emails, to tell you the truth. But after that, we communicated mostly through email and phone calls. He lived in Sri Lanka, of course, so there was a big time difference. And plus, he was in his 80s when we were working together, so he'd be awake at 3 a.m, and he'd want to work on something, and sometimes he'd call at ungodly hours, but mostly he'd email. And that suited him because the email sits there waiting for you, doesn't it, until you're ready. But he was what I learned from him about in terms of going forward is how enthusiastic he stayed. Throughout his life, he'd be doing an interview about 2001, or he'd be given a doctorate by Liverpool University. These are events that I saw. And he'd always want to talk about the latest book, the next project. That was always the big thing with him, going forward and producing new stuff and the new ideas. So that's what I want to be when I grow up, is like Arthur in his old age.
Well, yeah, and so speaking of the latest book, why don't you tell us about the Medusa Chronicles, just how'd the idea for this come about?
Well, as I said, it was kind of Al's idea, I suppose, but it was more like something that exploded in the middle of a conversation, an email conversation. So there we were. We've known each other for 25 years, I think, before Al was published, so we email about this and that, and that story, Meeting with Medusa in particular, grabbed Al at a young age. There was a serialized version in a magazine in England with great illustrations, you can imagine, in a boys' magazine. So that had always stuck in Al's mind, and we were talking about this, and Al said to me, we should do a sequel. I think it was just a throwaway joke, but then I thought, wow, hang on, could you do that? So I went off immediately to read the story, and I could immediately see how you could develop enough material for a novel. At least there's a hell of a lot in there. Falcon's own personal story. There's Jupiter. There's the whole hint about the conflict between man and machine in the future, which itself was a kind of alternate history, you see, because as seen from 1971, the computers were going to be like hell in 2001, kind of mainframes with personalities. Clarke didn't really foresee the internet as we have it now, with lots of dumb machines connected together in a kind of big smart network. So these machines would have personalities. They'd be more like Hal, maybe embodied somehow. But that's an alternate history, a different kind of technological development. And then in the background of the story as well, there's Clarke's general concerns and his themes. He wrote most of his stories about against the background of a world government. This story was set in 2099, so the end of this century, by which time there's a mature world government in place. And once we're no longer fighting wars and spending money on armaments, we can spend it on expansive space programs and cleaning up the planet and so forth. So you get this very utopian picture in our near future, of how the world could be made a better place. So it's kind of vision that's been rather lost now. And again, it was something that was good to go back to. So all this kind of struck me in a blinding flash, really, in the first half an hour or so, reading the story. So I got back to Al quickly, and we quickly started bouncing the ideas backwards and forward.
Right, well, say a little bit more about this alternate history, because you had to come up with some way to get from 1971 to people exploring Jupiter in 2099, right? So what was that sequence of events that you dreamed up?
Well, yeah, we had two choices, really. We could either just ignore Clarke's dates altogether, but it seemed more interesting to try and make it fit to Clarke's timetable. It doesn't seem any way to me, starting from where we are now, that we're going to get to Jupiter by 2099. We'll probably be looking to get to Mars with humans by then. But looking back to 1971, we were still in the middle of the Apollo lunar landings, and I suppose even by that time, the investment decisions had been drawn back a bit. They were going to go for the space shuttle as opposed to a mission to Mars. That was on Nixon's White House just after Apollo 11 landed, in fact. But at the time, space still looked like a very expansive arena. The space shuttle was going to lead to the space station soon, which would lead to a Mars mission soon, perhaps in the 80s or the 90s. This is the 1990s, of course. So clearly the history that Clarke was basing his story on was looking from our perspective now, it was an alternate history. So we chose to do it straight as an alternate history. In the book, you have history changes when an asteroid is approaching the Earth in the 60s. And so instead of going to the moon with Apollo Saturn technology, NASA deflects the asteroid with the Saturn V's and so forth. Great sacrifice, huge cost, sacrifice to the astronauts. But history's changed. The moon landings are postponed, but the astronauts are heroes, and the value of a space effort couldn't have been made more graphic, So the White House and around the world were happy to invest masses of money into an expansive space program and move on from there. Larry Niven, another great science fiction writer, came up with this good line a while ago. He said, the reason the dinosaurs got extinct is because they didn't have a space program. So that's pretty much it. We would like the dinosaurs, with the asteroid having missed, realizing that we needed a space program just to stay alert for things like that. And then a space program would have brought benefits of other kinds, such as maybe power from space as opposed to from sources on the ground, and so on. Resources from space instead of mining the Earth. But it would have made a difference technologically as well, with all the investment going into the big machinery. Less focus on IT, artificial intelligence, computing, and all that. Whereas in the real world, we've gone the other way, of course. There were primitive computers in the Apollo spacecraft, which were kind of primitive spacecraft. Now, we still have primitive spacecraft, but we've got very advanced computers in the real world. So in our alternate history, you have very advanced spacecraft, but primitive computers comparatively.
Right. Well, and say a little bit more about these efforts to draw resources from the solar system, because you have these robots out in the Oort Cloud kind of flinging ice meteors back at Earth.
Yeah, that's the idea. Yeah, there are masses of resources out there if you can only get to them. The big hurdle really is getting off the Earth or getting stuff back to the Earth, the big cost of getting out of our gravity well. But once you're up there, it's very easy to fling stuff around. And we imagined, this is Al really, he's done a lot of stuff about mining the outer solar system. And but yeah, there could actually be 100,000 planets bigger than Pluto out in the Oort Cloud, which is a huge cloud extending halfway to the nearest star surrounding the solar system, as we understand it. Masses of resources, and these things are rock and ice and full of organic chemicals as well. So, I mean, in principle, you could go out there, mine them for water and for foodstuffs. You know, you've got the raw materials of foodstuffs out there, or fling it back into the solar system to do things like create colonies in orbit around the Earth, water for Mars, which is notoriously dry, of course, and also lacking essential volatiles like nitrogen. If you wanted to make Mars like the Earth, the one thing you really need is nitrogen to give you not just a sort of gaseous atmosphere, but nitrogen for the plants and so forth. But all this stuff is out there. You just got to build an infrastructure to bring it home. So you'd have an Earth which could be reduced to a kind of park, is the way I envisage it, or a garden. Leave the Earth to do what it's really good at, which is support a biosphere, all the richness of life. Bring down the resources from space as you need them to have maintain an advanced civilization, and meanwhile move out into the solar system. So not just have like safety caches of humans scattered around the system, so no one dramatic event could destroy us ever, but also just for the adventure, the sheer adventure of exploring the moon, exploring Mars, and so forth. In one of my own novels called Voyage, I did a different kind of alternate history, in which the post-Apollo decisions to proceed with the space program was slightly different. Instead of building the shuttle, you build a quick trip to Mars. That was the program. The way Apollo Saturn was a quick trip to the moon, with not really much of a follow-on. A quick trip to Mars without much of a follow-on, but you still get to Mars. So the astronauts who walked on the moon would have been young enough to make it to Mars, at least some of them. John Young, for instance, who flew the space shuttle. So you could imagine him walking on Mars in 1985 and 1986. How fantastic, even if we hadn't really followed it up, what a fantastic adventure it would have been. And also the science would have been great as well. That one geologist on Mars for a day, to be honest, could probably have achieved more than all the probes we've sent up there so far, working robotically and remotely. So it was a kind of a fulfillment of working on a book now was a kind of fulfillment of all these lost visions, if you like.
Yeah. Well, so you have this civilization, they're exploiting the resources in the Oort Cloud, and then they're also doing mining in the upper atmosphere in Jupiter?
Yes. Yeah, Jupiter is this is another old space dream, really. Jupiter is a great source of isotopes for fusion. There's one isotope of helium called helium-3 in particular, which is ideal for clean fusion, relatively clean fusion, but it's vanishingly scarce on the Earth. I've seen one study which shows that one interstellar space probe, unmanned, would use up all the resources on the Earth of this stuff, helium-3. It's clearly much too valuable to use. It's there on the moon, but scattered very thinly. You'd have to sort of scour the entire face of the moon to extract this stuff. It's there in Jupiter, very thinly scattered again, but Jupiter's so big, there's a lot of it. So you could have floating factories to produce this stuff, export it to the Earth for relatively clean energy. But Jupiter it's not really a place for humans, and so it's an ideal place for the machines, really. So our machines, as I said, they're kind of more like androids, the human-like individual entities, but clearly with robot bodies, so they're capable of withstanding the conditions within Jupiter. Off they go, but they start pursuing their own agenda within Jupiter, exploring its interior, and ultimately making contact with other kinds of life forms in Jupiter.
Right. So I mean, a lot of this book deals with Falcon and other characters descending through the atmosphere into the depths of Jupiter. When you're writing about what's down there, how much of that is based on known science and how much is based on your imagination?
Well, as far as possible, it's kind of both really. As far as possible on known science, but we know so little about the interior of Jupiter. So there's plenty of room for imagination within that, if you see what I mean. So I think everything we come up with in there is possible. There's nothing actually ruled out by physical law or by observation. It's all possible. But on the other hand, we do know very little. The new probe that's on its way there, Juno, I think we've got a lot of hopes for that. It's only an orbiter, but it should tell us a lot about Jupiter's interior and what the structure of the atmosphere and so on is really like. But the models of the atmosphere that we have are quite old now. I think they go back. Well, they certainly go back to the 60s. Carl Sagan, as I said, came up with this idea of life forms in these cloud layers. You have a layer of ammonia ice, and you have a layer of water ice or water vapor maybe, and methane in there somewhere, and so forth. These components would separate out a lot of organic chemistry from the sun at the top of the atmosphere, so there are organic chemicals floating around in there. So you could have some kind of aerial life form evolving in this kind of soupy, thick, kludgy atmosphere. Is it really like that in there? We don't know. We've thrown one probe in when Galileo, the orbiter, arrived in the 90s. It had a small atmospheric probe that was thrown in there, burned up quite quickly, but it did return readings on the structure of the atmosphere that it actually found, and it found it was much drier than expected, much less water than everybody expected from external readings. But that's typical, really. You could throw a probe at Earth and it would land in the desert, say, and you think there's no water, or it lands in the ocean and you think it's full of water. So one pinpoint probe isn't really a proof of anything one way or the other. It's slightly concerning that the one experimental verification we have shows the models are all wrong. But I think we're really hoping that Juno will tell us more about that. But yeah, to answer your question, that Jupiter, as we showed there, and the rest of the solar system, we go out, as you say, to the Oort Cloud, we're on Mars. It all fits in with what we know now, with what's possible out there. The thing is, though, what we know evolves so quickly now, which is fantastic. I mean, I'm in my late 50s now, so I can remember the first Mariner probe going to Mars, and they sent it over it was just a flyby. They sent it over a region of Mars where they still thought there'd be canals, not artificial, but huge channels of some kind, some geological features. Sent it over there, and what do they find? Craters. Entirely unexpected. So suddenly Mars, from being an Earth-like world, looked like a moon-like world. But then as more information came in, the huge volcanoes and so forth, and the Mariner Valley, you start to realize that Mars was a much stranger, more difficult place to live, but much stranger and therefore more interesting place scientifically than anybody imagined before. And since then, we've had the probes to the outer planets, the Voyagers, and so on. All those fantastic new worlds out there, really. Moons of Jupiter like Europa with an ocean which may harbor life under an ice crust. And now, of course, you have information about the planets beyond the solar system, which in turn shed light on how our solar system might have formed. It's just fantastic, So just in my lifetime alone, you've got this revolution in what we know about the planets. But for a fiction writer, the exciting thing is just trying to keep up in a way. What new possibilities does this open up? What would it be like to live on these worlds as they are being revealed to us, and what kind of life might we find there, and so on?
Right. My dad is a scientist. He works in low temperature superconductivity. So this line kind of caught my eye, where you say that the interior of Jupiter might be composed of metallic hydrogen that might be useful as a room temperature superconductor or a high energy density fuel.
Yeah. To be honest, I know very little about that beyond what you said there. But there is this speculation, these exotic forms of hydrogen. I think the idea of mining it is fairly far away. But Jupiter is a sort of natural laboratory for this kind of exotica. It's strange that we seem to understand the sun pretty well. The model of the sun's interior has stayed pretty static since, I think, the 1920s. It's fairly simple physics. It's just hydrogen and helium with this immense mass crushing everything, and you can predict what the temperature of the core must be. So the models of the sun are fairly stable, but the models of Jupiter, kind of somewhere between the Earth and the Sun, it's 300 times the mass of the Earth. Much more uncertain because we don't know what happens to hydrogen, for instance, either the simplest element, in these strange conditions of high temperature and pressure that you find in there. So, that's fascinating to think that we might dig down there one day and, in a way, discovering. It's like doing a basic chemistry by actually going there and seeing what's going on in this kind of natural laboratory.
Yeah. I mean, you also in this book, you have some really advanced futuristic technology. There's the momentum pump and the asymptotic drive. Could you talk about those?
Those are, I think some of the more advanced technologies in the book are stolen a bit from Clarke. One thing we did was read a lot of Clarke outside the novel itself, the novella itself, to get more of a background of his of where it fit into his general work. I mean, we both read a lot of Clarke anyway, but there's no harm to study it all again. And so in the near future, he imagined fusion rockets, nuclear fission rockets, for instance, taking Falcon out to Jupiter, as in, say, 2001. And the design of those things was fairly stable in Clarke's mind, at least. The big dumbbell shape, like Discovery in 2001. He'd been working on designs like that since the 50s. However, he was interested in exotica as well. So, and there were two things in particular that caught his attention in his later life. One was the idea of an inertialess drive, where you could somehow take away the inertia of an object, like making it massless. And, the photon particle of light is massless and it zips off at the speed of light. So the idea being that if you remove the inertia, this quality from a massive object, it could be either very easy to move or simply move spontaneously at very high velocities. The inertialess drive. I think that's in a way that's become more plausible in a sense in recent years because of the Higgs boson. The Higgs boson is this exotic particle which gives other particles mass. Strangely, so mass is imbued by this boson. If you could somehow turn the boson off or detach it from a body, then you could reduce the mass and so reduce the inertia. Or maybe inertia is something to do with being coupled into space-time. That's another speculative possibility. So he pinched that from Clarke, really, and the momentum pump is another variant of that. How you could move a moon with a small engine. This is pushing at the boundaries, but there are speculative papers that you can find on really at the fringe of physics on how this kind of thing might be done. But I think the reason there's room in physics for doing that kind of thing is because physics is so incomplete. We've got a very good model of the large scale universe in general relativity, so gravity and the evolution of the stars and the motion of the galaxies and all of that, the expansion of the universe. And on the very small scale, quantum mechanics, which has been tested to many decimal places, as indeed has relativity with things like the recent detection of gravity waves, two fantastically well-founded theories of the small and the large, but we don't have a good theory of where they meet in the middle, which is quantum gravity. So, I know there are many models of it around, the string theory, but that's still elusive, I would say. And that's where these exotic possibilities like hyperdrives and inertialess drives and so forth might lurk, which is great for the science fiction writer. If you want something beyond the known, then you go for that. Personally, and Clarke did this as well, he would fill his books with afterwards listing the references for these speculations on the hyperdrives and so forth. So it's not authoritative. This is only guesswork, but at least it's educated guesswork about how this thing might be possible, which makes it all the more interesting that this thing might happen one day. It's not magic, but it's very speculative science.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the wildest ideas in this book is one of the characters talks about enclosing the entire planet of Saturn in kind of a shell that people could walk on and live on.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think that, in a way, is less fantastic than some, because the gravity of the surface of Saturn is only about 1g, the same as the Earth's. So a structure that's capable of withstanding 1g, will be able to withstand, will be able to support itself if you could build a thing in the first place. It's not like, say, Larry Niven's Ringworld, this belt whirling around the sun, or a sun, so fast that it gives you a spin gravity of 1g, but it's so big that it's about the same distance as the Earth is from the sun, 100 million miles or so, and the stresses on that will be similar to the stresses on that hold the nucleus of an atom together. So that's a pretty exotic material. You need to build that. But to build, I suspect that you could build a shell around Saturn of fairly. You might need some magic carbon nanofiber tubing, that sort of stuff, but not beyond the bounds of possibility. But the big trick with that, of course, will be building it in the first place, assembling the material, and so forth. Probably the way to do it will be to lift material off Saturn somehow, mine Saturn for the material itself, and build it somehow in place. So I think as megastructures go, it's relatively plausible, which and into pleasing thoughts. One strange thing that was my personal one of my personal contributions to the book, which I dreamed up knowing that Saturn had a gravity of about 1g, about the same as the Earth. But then I started to wonder, how come a gas giant like Saturn has got a similar gravity to the Earth? How can that be? So even Jupiter, it's only a couple of times or 3 times Earth's gravity, so it's similar. And there have now been studies of the exoplanets, the planets beyond the solar system, showing a strange kind of convergence of planetary formation, or a coincidence of planetary formation, that you get about a G. The big rocky planets compress and sort of stabilize their gravity at about a G, and then the gas giants as well seem to diffuse out to a certain size, so that you've got much larger masses, but they're so big that the gravity again is about a G or a couple of G. So it's a strange thing that being adapted to a gravity well of about a G, it doesn't suit you to live on the moon, which is only a sixth of a G, or on, in a space habitat with 0g. But it actually suits you quite well to live on a lot of worlds around the universe, where the gravity is, near to 1g more or less. Even a shell around a gas giant would give you about a G. So, yeah, my interesting fact for the day.
Well, so you said that was one of your contributions. Could you just kind of lay out what, like, you and Al Reynolds working together, kind of what you each brought to this project?
Well, the way we had a quick fire exchange of emails and ideas to begin with, and phone calls, coming up with a lot of ideas. Then we met face to face at the World SF Convention in London in 2014, just for half a day. But by then we had masses of material and ideas, and I think the good notion of how we go forward. But we came up with a breakdown there of, we put the thing into 6 parts. The whole thing was going to be episodic anyway, because the troubled century is going off through the future, the chronicles of this imaginary future. So it naturally broke down into episodes, which we could split up between us. And I think, roughly speaking, I did more of the earlier episodes, including the alternate history of the Apollo days. Al did more of the later episodes out in the solar system. Originally, we were going to go out to the stars as well, but in the end, we stayed in the solar system. And I think that's a slight that shows a slight difference of bias there. I've done the grand, very far future stuff in my own novels, but also a lot of alternate histories, near future kind of books as well. And Al is somewhere in the middle of that, off in the middle distance when we're out in the Oort Cloud, but not yet reached the stars. So that was one difference, I think, our personal preferences for chunks of the time scale in a way. But there is another difference which some of the reviewers have picked up, which is a difference in style. I think I'm a bit more like Clarke in writing style, slightly more cerebral in a way, and cooler, and the characters are interact in a fairly restrained way. They feel deeply, but they don't necessarily act on impulse. That sort of thing. So at one point, Falcon watches the machines take over the Earth. As an observer, he's coolly reporting what happens. He is angry, and he's newly motivated to take on the machines again, but he takes it coolly. Al, though, is a more kind of visceral writer, I think. He gets into the guts of the characters. He has very physical confrontations between them. He writes in a very physical way as well. You see the quivering lips and the clenched fists and so forth. So his confrontations were much more vivid, I think, in that way, interpersonal confrontations. In the end, we wrote these chunks, put them together, and went through the book several times, smoothing out the joins, if you like, rewriting all the sections together. So I think the differences in style smoothed the way in the end to some extent, but I think they're probably still there. But that's okay. It isn't a Clarke book, It's not a Baxter or a Reynolds book either. It's a kind of something in between.
Yeah, there's actually a funny story I heard about the first time you met Al Reynolds. Could you tell that story?
Oh yeah, as I said, we met at about 25 years ago, I think, and it was at a 65th birthday party for Brian Aldous, the great writer, which was being run by Interzone, which is a short fiction magazine that I think we both got our first breaks in there. Al's about 10 years younger than me, which matters a lot less now, but back then, so I'd be mid-30s, Al was mid-20s. I was that little bit ahead, a couple of books published. Al was just starting out, and he comes up to me slightly starstruck, and he said to me, "Oh, Steve, nice to meet you." He said, "Of the previous generation of writers, you're the one who most inspires me." So I'm 35. I felt like 105. I felt like H.G. Wells, So, but it was all a slightly shy and awkward moment, But I tease Al about that regularly ever since.
Right, and you put a scene in this book, right, that was inspired by that?
Yes, that's right. Somewhere near the beginning. So you have Falcon, who goes to Jupiter. It's actually in Clarke's novella. A guy called Springer lands on Pluto in the same year. So you have these two big events during the year 2099. At the end of the year, they're both invited to a big oceanic event with the world president to see in the new year. And Springer, this guy, he's more media savvy than our rather clumsy cyborg hero Falcon. So trailed by cameramen and so on, Springer walks up to this guy and goes, "Falcon, oh yes, what a great guy you're. Of the previous generation of explorers, you're my big inspiration." And then he's called away from the photo shoot, leaving Falcon seething. So yes, we smuggle that in there. Yes.
Yeah. Well, actually, okay. So speaking of the world president, you mentioned that in Clarke's universe, there's this world government.
Yeah.
And obviously, like as we're recording this, there was just the Brexit vote for England to leave the EU, and I'm just wondering what you think about the prospects of world government from our current vantage.
Yeah. Well, Clarke, he didn't write a consistent universe. Although some of his books, the 2001 series, 4 books there, did fit into a single universe. But he did have these consistent themes, and one of them, was the emergence of a world government, which he thought would come about peacefully, I think, thanks to mostly communication, global communication. That would spread education, for one thing, and just increasing our global awareness. If you can see the other guy suffering, it makes you less willing to go to war. So his technological interests mapped down onto those kind of political interests. He'd known Ola Stapleton, I mentioned, who was a great visionary of political future and a future without war. He was never a political activist, I don't think, but that very much influenced him. He saw this is the way for an advanced society to go. And of course, he was a generation who lived through the Second World War. And after the war, you did get great global institutions emerging. The United Nations, for one thing. Yeah, but also the European Union, starting off as an economic community. So a kind of regional template of the world government. And it had economic goals, but its big political goal was to stop war between France and Germany. Germany unified in 1870 by attacking France under Bismarck. And it worked, from the Germans' point of view. But France and Germany went to war 3 times in 70 years, between 1870 and 1940. And so this clearly could not go on. It was like a huge European civil war. So the European Union began as a peacekeeping organization specifically to keep France and Germany from going to war again. And it's worked, hasn't it? They are now closely united at the heart of this European project. Britain and other countries joined later, and Britain has always had more of a tradition of independence from Europe. To Britain, Europe was a problem, even when we weren't actively at war with one chunk of it or another. Britain saw itself as kind of managing Europe in a rather superior way, balancing off one side against the other, maintaining trade and so forth. So we had the tradition of independence. That was reinforced really during the Second World War, I suppose, when Britain stood alone for a while against Hitler after France had fallen and Belgium had fallen. However, yes, eventually we joined. We didn't go all the way in. The European Union has a single currency spanning Spain to Poland. It's quite remarkable. The widest scattering of a currency union like that since Roman times. Britain stayed out because it could see the economic disadvantages as well as the political advantages. So the European Union, it's a great political project, and I'm sure Clarke would have agreed with that. However, in practical terms, it's far from perfect. There's what the British call a democratic deficit in there. It's difficult to see how, when I cast my vote in an election in Britain, I'm influencing what goes on in Brussels at the level of the European Parliament. There are direct elections to the Parliament, but the powers are split all over the place. And when countries have problems with various aspects of the economic settlement, Greece, for instance, recently going into recession, the central authorities can be pretty tough. So it's quite a flawed union. You give up certain powers, and yet you don't seem to have the democratic mandate to control it. However, in my view, personally, it's clearly a step in the right direction compared to what was there 100 years ago, let's say, when we were immersed in the First World War. But no, there's always been a lot of discontent in Britain at being involved in the thing in the first place. And so we had this very close vote. I think most commentators would say it was a vote about other things than the European Union, or in addition to the European Union. Late capitalism, the continual erosion of traditional industries, the great migration crises that we face in Europe, partly from climate problems, but also from political problems in the Middle East. All of that stuff is very destabilizing, and so I think there's a certain protest vote against that. My own personal view is fairly sanguine. I voted to remain in, but I'm not too concerned that we voted out because we were, as I said, we were partly out anyway. We weren't in a single currency. So I think we'll go from one level of detachment to a slightly wider level of detachment. And I do think global action in the end, is necessary. Because we face global problems, the migration crises, climate change, resource depletion, all these things are going to hit us on a global level. And so, for instance, the UN organized climate change initiatives, imperfect as they are, all those seem entirely in the right direction to go to me. We have to work as a species to manage the planet, and it's our shared home after all, and do it together. And for all its imperfections, for all, this is democracy in action in a way. It's all one big argument. I think we're slowly moving towards that kind of arrangement, with more power effectively being invested in the international and global institutions and less at the national level. But I do think the big challenge, as Europe has shown, is democratic legitimacy. I bet Americans would say the same thing. You want to be able to vote that guy out, whether he's your local mayor or he's the world president. You've got to be able to vote the guy out. Otherwise, you're not going to accept the deal. So I think we're at a bump in the road from that point of view. And I'm not actually sure how Clarke himself would have voted actually if he'd had the vote and been around. I think he would have railed against the democratic deficiency of the actuality versus the goals of the post-war founders. So it is kind of interesting that we publish a book about the world government just as Britain leaves a European government. But I suppose it shows up the issues.
Right. Well, you've mentioned that you're a big fan of H.G. Wells, who also campaigned for a world government. And I saw you say in an interview that you were actually pretty critical of his conception of that. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, Wells, that's my other big project at the moment. I'm doing a sequel to The War of the Worlds by Wells, which that'll be called The Massacre of Mankind, and that'll be out next year. Which is it's like another collaboration, actually. The same as working with Al and with Clarke. You read around the guy's work. But yeah, he could clearly see what was wrong with late Victorian society and so Edwardian society. He abhorred the war, the First World War, when it came along. And his vision of the future was clear in some ways, I would say, but flawed in other ways. He could see the need for universal education for a start, proper education for women, which he saw as a great waste of human potential. Some things are also of his time. He was a great one for cleaning up the cities, clean streets. You have a lot of filth in the contemporary cities in which his books are set, but the futuristic cities are always very clean. Because you can imagine, it's the late age of the horse. Everything's full of horse dung and rubbish, and the streets are black, the cities are black from soot. So he wanted cleanliness and education and good food and so forth. But how to achieve that? In a modern utopia, for instance, which is his most striking fictional version of this, it's actually an alternate history which develops from a Roman Empire that never fell. But they have a kind of senate of self-appointed scientific minds who run everything on behalf of everybody else. So at that point in his life, this is about 1905, I think he thought democracy was a bit of a bust. You had to give up control to the smart people. And they would run things for us. They'd allocate our education for us. They'd weed out defectives from society one way or the other and send them off to colonies elsewhere. And he couldn't seem to see where this kind of scientific government was liable to lead. And it led, of course, to Nazi Germany, that kind of idea. A scientific elite, scientific running of humanity, a scientific categorization of humanity, kind of quasi-scientific in a way, leads directly in the end to eugenics and the gas ovens, unfortunately. So Wells lived long enough to see the Second World War come about and the horrors of Nazi Germany. And George Orwell, who wrote 1984 later, he skewered Wells really with one quote. He said, "Nazi Germany is what you've been arguing for all your life." So that's why I think you have to be critical, in retrospect at least, of Wells. He had this great vision of a unified utopian world. But early in his life, he couldn't seem to see that scientists aren't to be trusted, basically. Nobody is to be trusted. As Churchill said, democracy is the worst system of government in the world except for all the others. At least you can vote the guy out, Wells did evolve his views later in life very greatly. And he was involved, actually, towards the end of his life he died in 1946, but in the later stages of the war, they were already planning for the peace and the founding of the UN. And Wells was very influential in getting the Declaration of the Rights of Man drawn up, the International Declaration as accepted by the UN and later by bodies like Europe. I think if for nothing else, he should be remembered for that. He kind of seen the follies of his ways. So by the end, rather than prescribing forms of world government, he was looking for ways to ensure, right to the other end, ensure the rights of the individual to a fair life and a decent education and so forth. So yeah, you have to, I think he will be critical, I think, of his early musings. But we all learn by experience, don't we?
Yeah. Well, so you've mentioned that you collaborated with Clarke and Alistair Reynolds, and in a way with H.G. Wells. You also collaborated with Terry Pratchett. I was just wondering if you could say, are there any marked differences between working with these different authors?
Well, I think the commonality is, maybe I've been lucky with my collaborators, but the commonality is basically enthusiasm for the stuff. We'd all had a background in the stuff that we read, even with Clarke. That was true, who was 40 years older than me. So enthusiasm for the background, for the material, and for the actual writing itself. But obviously, Terry was a very different writer to either Al or Clarke. But he was a science fiction fan as a young reader. His first stories were science fiction. I think what he really wanted to be was an SF writer. His first couple of novels were SF, in fact. He actually met Clarke when Terry was about 16, a young fan, and Clarke was kind to him. So he always called Clarke Uncle Arthur after that. Not to his face, but that was his position in the genre as far as Terry was concerned. But yeah, Terry was quite different by the time I worked with him. So he'd gone through the whole of Discworld, of course. and he developed that very dry, humorous voice on the one hand, and his approach to characters was quite different. So we had a big science fictional frame. The project we worked on, The Long Earth, is about a whole a universe full of parallel Earths that you can simply walk into, each one slightly different from the rest. So it's a big idea that I think was too big in a way for Terry, who likes to work with individual people. So when we collaborated, I brought the kind of framework, the maps and timelines and so on of how this universe could be structured. But what Terry was brilliant at was getting hold of a character and really drilling down into their motivation. Our character Joshua is the lead character of these books is a young boy who is particularly adept at stepping into these other worlds, and so he becomes a kind of reluctant hero in a way, but he becomes a kind of Daniel Boone recluse, just going off for sabbaticals as he calls them, and losing himself in the wilderness basically. And Terry was really good at drilling right down into the motivation of this character with his troubled background. You know, he's an orphan and so on. So that's one big difference was this really deep characterization, which Terry was capable of. You clearly need characterization in SF, and I think it's underrated actually. How good the best are at characterization. Clarke and Wells, for instance, but they fulfill a certain role in SF. The hero is really the idea, or maybe the universe itself, you know, is a character overwhelming everything else. And there's no room for this kind of really deep characterization that you might get in mainstream fiction. But Terry had a good go of it, I think, in Discworld as well, with characters like Commander Vimes, you know, his alcoholic copper, and so on, or Tiffany Aking, his young adult heroine. He got really deeply into the heads of these people in this fantastic world. So I think there's certainly one difference is the balance of characterization versus ideation, if you like.
Yeah. I saw a quote that said that as a writer, your order and Terry was chaos, and it was kind of an interesting mix of order and chaos when you came together.
Yeah, that's, yeah. Did I say that? Somebody said it anyway. But at one point we were trying to figure out the structure of the Long Earth, infinite in principle, but how could you make it more interesting? Each is slightly different from the rest, and I thought in a fairly linear way. You know, each slightly different until after about 100 worlds you get to an Ice Age world, and you go a bit further, it's a dinosaur world, and so forth. But Terry was all for randomness, you know. Suppose you go along 10 worlds and then suddenly, bang, it's entirely different from anything you expect. So it could be a desert world in the middle of the Ice Ages, but it could be something very strange, like one of his favorites was a cue ball world. Entirely smooth, like an abstraction. There's just nothing there. There's air to breathe and so forth. But there's blank landscape, nothing there at all. Like a huge skating rink, maybe, or a roller skating rink. Great for roller skating. So Terry liked to break this up with just random changes and so forth. And we talked to a mathematician at one point, Ian Stewart, who collaborated with Terry on the Science of Discworld books, talking about this kind of structure. And Ian said in modern thinking with the mathematicians, yeah, the most fertile kind of structures you can have are a balance between order and chaos. Where, for instance, a fighter plane, modern fighter planes are deliberately made unstable, all controlled by computer, so that if it's unstable, you can deliberately flip it quickly into another state, so you can do very fast turns and quick maneuvering and so forth. So it's managed chaos in a way. So this mathematician said maybe our long Earth was the same kind of thing. It's orderly, but it's on the edge of chaos. So interesting things could happen the whole time. You're about to tip over the edge of the wave. So I think between me and Terry, this clash of order and chaos was quite productive in the end. One thing I was careful to do right from the beginning was to make a note of every mad random idea we had, and try and get as many of them into the early books as possible, just in case we want to come back to them later. You know, in case it turned out to be really good as a sort of hook for the sequels, and that paid off, I can tell you.
Yeah. I was also just curious if you had seen the Sci-Fi Channel adaptation of Childhood's End, and if so, what you thought of that.
Oh no, haven't seen it actually. No. So I'm behind on that one, I'm afraid.
Okay. So then you said in an interview, NASA, I'm afraid, has become a sclerotic, big organization locked into the space station project, which will generate a lot of jobs, but little else. I was wondering if you could say what you think we should be doing in terms of near-term space exploration.
All right, I think that's probably a fairly old quote, which I suspect it was valid 15 years ago, maybe. I did a lot of research into NASA when I wrote my novel Voyage that I mentioned earlier. Alternate history of the space program in the 70s and 80s, and a couple of other books later. And they were extremely generous. There's a lot of science fiction fans in NASA, you can imagine. And I was shown around the hardware, crawled around the space shuttle simulator, saw a shuttle launch, which is an astounding experience, very physical experience, very visceral. And shown some of the plans they were drawing up at the time for Mars missions, if the call ever came. But when the space station, I've never been a big fan of that project, to be honest, because it does seem it has kept people in space, which is a good thing. It's kept a presence in space. We've learned some lessons from it, but we could have done much more for the money, I tend to feel. And if you go around NASA, well, this was true about 10, 15 years ago at least. You did get the impression that it was kind of hanging on. You want a long program with an extended deadline, which never actually gets anywhere, but keeps the jobs going. But you can understand why that was from the Apollo peak of, I think it was like 500,000 people employed in the space program, including the contractors as well, at the peak. So what do they do when Apollo is gone and the program starts shrinking? So I have been quite a fan of Robert Zubrin, of Mars Direct, looking for lean, mean ways of getting to Mars quickly, whittle it right down in the spirit of the 60s. Actually, they before Apollo, there was a pretty expansive long-term program for building gigantic successors to the Saturn V and using those to get to Mars. In the end, they focused on the goal, just get to the moon with a Saturn V, a kind of middle-sized rocket, do it quickly with this ingenious way of landing a separate lander, or lots of ways to save mass and size and development time and so forth. Just go for the goal. So, and I think particularly once Zubrin's work came along, which must be about 20 years ago now, I couldn't quite see why this wasn't taken with more enthusiasm by NASA and by Congress and those who hold the purse strings as well. I spoke to Clarke a lot about this actually, and I asked him whether he was disappointed that the kind of alternate future that we describe in Medusa didn't come about with missions to Jupiter by the end of the century and so on. And he said no, he wasn't disappointed at all. He said that realistically, when he started back in the 30s or the 40s, he didn't really believe, I don't think, that humans would walk on the moon in his lifetime, or that we get as far as we have. He's kind of disappointed that we stopped at the moon in terms of human exploration, but he loved all the deep space exploration, the voyages to the outer planets and so on, and he worked it into his fiction. It inspired his fiction. The internet, the early internet, was great for him because he just got onto the NASA sites and downloaded everything they had. He loved it. And so now, I think NASA now is more going in the right direction, I'd say, given the constraints on them. Very imaginative missions, some great science being done. So, yeah. Unfortunately, I don't think in my lifetime we're going to see a human walk on Mars because the huge funding boost will never be there. There may be some motive for doing it, discovering life, for instance, and a real motive to get there. But I have to praise the half of NASA that does the unmanned, the uncrewed probes and the fabulous science over the years, which, well, I talked about this before, it's absolutely transformed humanity's vision of the universe in my lifetime, and indeed mine as well.
Yeah. You also, in that same interview, you were talking about how we're at this absolutely critical moment in human history. You say, if we get it wrong over the next few decades, our descendants, if there are any, might not forgive us. Well,
I think that could be true, don't you? The challenge of the climate shift seems very real to me. You can argue forever about whose fault it is, but we've just had a series of record highs in terms of average temperatures for the months. In Britain, it was predicted 20 years ago, and I remember distinctly the long-term forecast for Britain was more storms, basically. We're stuck between a continent and an ocean, masses of turbulent air, more storms, which is exactly what we've had now. And so year on year, we're having to beef up our flood defences and so forth. And it's chaotic as well, to go back to the theme of order versus chaos. These massive storms could hit anywhere. You know, we had it in my region a couple of years ago, well, about 5 years ago. This last winter, it was the other side of the country and so on. So really, if you take a long view, it's working out exactly as planned. At the same time, we've got the challenge of the oil running out and so forth. And the very fact that the energy sources we need to use to fix these problems could potentially worsen the climate problems as well. But we still have a window to act, it seems to me. We still have a window to do things like clean up the power generation systems and maybe use off-Earth resources to support the Earth as we go towards, it seems to be, these two competing goals. One is a high civilization, which supports everybody to a high standard of living, high meaning, you know, as we have in the Western countries. And the other goal being a healthy, stable ecology going forward to future generations as well. So it's one heck of a challenge, but you know, I think we're aware of the importance of both goals, and I think I'm fundamentally an optimist. You know, I mean, you know, anyone of my age has lived through the horrible fear of nuclear war soon. I think when my generation were kids, we didn't think there'd be a nuclear war tomorrow, but I think we didn't think we'd grow old. Sometime between now and then, you know, we thought the bombs would fall, so we'd never get to plant a tree in a garden and see it grow fully. That kind of thing, you know. That nightmare seems to have gone away, and now there are different kind of nightmares for the new generations coming up. But I'm basically an optimist. If we can survive the threat of nuclear war, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and all that happened, then I think we can muddle our way through this in the end. But it's a challenge that we can't shirk. But previous generations haven't shirked their challenges, and going back to Clarke's generation, you know, the West stood up to the Nazis, even though that was a huge human and political and economic hit. If you look at it that way, we all came out of it better in the end.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we're pretty much out of time. So just, do you have any final words you want to say, or any projects you want to mention, or anything like that?
No, I think I've covered everything, haven't I? With producer. I will just say my next, the projects I'm working on now, my own solo projects. So a break from collaborating, off to the far future. My own starting point was a universe called the Zeely sequence. Do you know the Zeely is XWL? Yeah. Off in the far future, and that's a real expression of my own influences, I think, including Clarke. So my first stories and books were set in that universe, and I kept on going back, which I think is a good idea. Clarke kept on going back to some of his early works and rewriting them, reworking them, expanding them. And it's not a bad idea, I don't think, because the beginning is where your unconscious is more in control of your creative process than your consciousness. So looking back to that is a good way of thinking, what am I really interested in? What are my real concerns, you know? So my current project is a rework of some of that stuff, kind of reboot with you know my current sensibilities, more modern science and so forth. And so that's great fun.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm really looking forward to that. And so we've been speaking with Stephen Baxter, and this new book, once again, it's called The Medusa Chronicles with Alistair Reynolds. So, Stephen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Stephen Baxter for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to Matt Kressel, who just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Matt writes, I've been listening to the Geek's Guide to the Galaxy podcast for a while now, lately while I go to the gym, and I really enjoy the episodes that host David Barr-Kirtley produces. There are always thoughtful, intelligent discussions, and David is always well prepared for his guests. For example, it's pretty obvious that before each guest comes on, if it's an author, he reads their books, sometimes many of them, and has lots of questions to ask. Not the superficial ones that you usually hear in mediocre interviews, but really intelligent questions about specific details, thoughts, and ideas from someone's work. I've been enjoying these podcasts for a while, and I thought it was high time I gave back, so I just signed up for their Patreon. Even if you don't donate, I highly recommend this podcast if it's not yet on your radar. So big thanks again to Matt Kressel for supporting us on Patreon. And if anyone else out there wants to send us $1 or $2 per episode, You can sign up to do that over at patreon.com/geeks. You can also sign up to make a one-time or fixed monthly contribution via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. And I'd like to give a special thank you to Ricardo Santos, who just became PayPal patron number 138. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. Alright, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.